What is economics? Well, it is a lot of things these days. For many people, it is the trade-offs they face. It is the opportunity costs. It is the incentives. It is how people react, how people behave. And it is the choices we face and the decisions we face. So altogether, this is economics, basically. So economics is in everyday life. We may not notice it. For you as students, since you're sitting and watching this video, you made a decision to go to university, and you most likely compared the benefits of going to university with the benefits of not going to university, or just going into, let's say, labor market. You compared the gains from doing university degree and then just going into work. I mean the labor market. The word economy originates from a Greek word, oikonomos. Oikonomos basically means a household manager. Back in days, I think Greek Orthodox Church had household managers. These were treasurers and finance managers. So today it's the equivalent of treasury and finance managers. Households and economies have much in common. Economies and households try to give fair share of resources to their members. It's like economies trying to make everyone have a better life, improve standard of living. Households try to do the same thing. They want to give every child or member of the household equal fair share, let's say, of education, clothing. So the process of managing the household or the economy is economics. And we ask a lot of questions in the household. For example, who needs to work? Who will look after the kids? Who pays the bills? How much do we need to earn? Similarly, in the economies, large economies, how much should be produced? What needs to be produced? It's how we make the decisions that is economics. Economics is part of whatever you do. Even if you do marketing, you deal with decisions. You will have to think at the margin. You compare the costs and benefits. You face opportunity costs, incentives, budgets. This is all economics. Right, so fundamental problem of economics is the scarcity, and economists deal with management of these limited resources. And scarcity is just the limited nature of society's resources. Like households, societies have limited resources. So societies cannot produce all the goods and services that everyone wishes to have. An example here, in March and April of 2020, so this year, I couldn't get hold of paracetamol, hand gel, and toilet rolls. Well, there were toilet rolls, the small packs, but I wanted a large pack. Well, in fact, everyone wanted the large pack at the time. But paracetamol, hand gel, there were not many. There were not any, in fact. I went to many shops. Today, my friend is saying to me that he is not able to book COVID-19 test. He is a key worker and he does regular tests because he faces clients or customers. So he needs to be tested regularly. But he is not able to do that. For the past 2 weeks, he hasn't been able to book a test. And economics studies how society manages its scarce resources. Now notice that today we have loads of toilet rolls. To an extent, we became better at managing our resources. We have hand gels on shop shelves now, paracetamol. You can buy as many as you want these days. We may as well get better in managing COVID tests as well, or in providing COVID tests as well at some point. So it took some time to work out a better allocation of resources, such as the toilet roll or anything else. So there was this great toilet paper rush, if you remember. Now we have this bunch of people here carrying loads of large packs of toilet papers, but here we have none left for this lady. Now, scarcity doesn't necessarily mean there's not enough to go around. It simply means that there is not enough to meet everyone's wants, to satisfy everyone's desires. Now, if I ask you to list everything that you want, you would probably give me a very long list. Perhaps some of you would have bottomless list, the unlimited wants. This is the case here where scarcity is relevant. So there's enough of everything. It's just our wants are endless. We want everything. So economists deal with how societies manage their scarce resources. Economists are also interested in how people make decisions, especially when facing certain situations. We'll start off with trade-offs. When people face trade-offs, they are dealing with options or choices. You may have heard that there aren't no such thing as a free lunch. In other words, nothing is free. So to get something that you like, you usually have to give up something else that you may like. For example, to study 1 more hour to prepare for this module, you will certainly give up 1 hour of TV time. Or playing a PS4, Xbox. Now let's take a more interesting example here. During the COVID pandemic, in the early days, hospitals needed beds. There was a huge demand spike for beds in the UK. So hospital managers faced trade-offs between having an additional bed for a COVID patient and admitting that additional patient with chronic disease. Both patients were entitled to this bed, but they had to make trade-offs. And hospitals face this sort of trade-offs. So in simple terms, trade-off is where one thing increases and another must decrease. Right, so let's move on to efficiency. It is a case of trying to get the maximum out of the limited resources, putting the scarce resources in such a way into use such that we receive the highest or the maximum output. So using the land, labor, and capital, these are the scarce resources, to maximize the output. If you think of a pie, the larger the pie, the higher the efficiency, given the scarce resources. Now, equality is about distributing economic prosperity or improving living standards uniformly among the members of society. Or equality is about fairness. It's like having a pie and slicing them equally, slicing the pie equally for everyone. So equality is concerned with how the output or the resources are distributed through the society. So let's give some examples on this point. If you want to have the highest efficiency, it's likely that you will lose equality, or the opposite is true as well. High equality means less efficiency. Economies or governments try to improve living standards such that there aren't too rich people and there aren't too poor people, so that the gap or income inequality is small or non-existent. But we have scarce resources, so we need to use them efficiently. Take an example. Public policies, they are usually aimed at equalizing the distribution of economic well-being. We have benefits system where governments pump money into the section of the society where people do not or are not able to work, but they also shouldn't be left behind, so the government gives them money through benefits system. Where does this money come from? Of course, from individuals' earnings. So people who work pay tax, and this tax is redistributed to other people. In this country, high earners pay higher taxes. It's a progressive taxing system. Tax rates increase as you earn more income. So if you look at it, in order to achieve this welfare equality or improve the well-being of poorer section of the society, the government taxes the hard-working high earners more. This creates imbalance between efficiency and equality. The decision to increase income tax on high earners to pay for the benefits basically may achieve great equality but reduce efficiency. In other words, it may be good to pump money into this sort of poorer society so that they can have a similar living standards as others who earn and work, but then the others who earn and work will see this as an off-putting situation, disincentivizing situation, I should say. They lose incentive to work harder now. They say, okay, I work harder, but as I earn more of my money is taken away from me. Then they reduce their labor input. In other words, the society is now not getting or not putting the labor into use properly. So in order to achieve equality, we're losing efficiency. Now if we pay more attention to efficiency, then we lose equality. To incentivize the high earners, taxes are reduced. So on the other hand, think of it this way. Those who receive high payments of benefits will think, well, I am still getting paid without working. So that creates another disincentivizing situation for these people who already are on benefits. And they also know that as they work, their benefits are reduced. So they tend to work less as a result. Again, labor capable of working will remain in benefit. Right, so that's the imbalance between efficiency and equality. And in fact, it's a trade-off, I should say, between efficiency and inequality. Now, economists recognize that the people face trade-offs, but facing trade-off doesn't itself tell us what decisions will be or should be made. It's the acknowledgement of individuals or their understanding that the consequences of these decisions are important. So that's what economists are interested in, and that's what we study as well in this course. When faced with trade-offs, people will have to compare costs and benefits of alternatives. For example, in order to go to university, you would have calculated the costs, compared these costs against the benefits, but not all costs are obvious. Not everything is financially measurable. Financially measurable. We cannot attach everything a pound sign and say, okay, this is the cost, these are the benefits. Some of the costs are not obvious to us. So when you are at the university, a cost that is not so obvious is the opportunity cost. If you didn't go to university, for example, you would have started your business, earned X amount of money. But now that amount of money is not earned, it's forgone. You give up on that. You chose this alternative course of action to study. So on top of your financial costs, the ones that you can put a dollar sign, add the opportunity cost. It is also kind of a financial cost, but it's not obvious. It is a theoretical cost in this case. It's just the amount that you give up has to be added to the financial cost to come up with the cost of going to university. And then you compare the benefits with the costs. So opportunity cost is whatever you are giving up to obtain some items. So in simple terms, it's just a loss of potential gain from other alternatives when one alternative is chosen. Economists assume that rational people think at the margin. Well, who are the rational people? The people who are consistently choosing the best course of action. These are the rational people, given their objectives and opportunities. Now, before moving further, we'll introduce a concept called marginal changes. These are basically small incremental adjustments to our plan of action. Now, rational decision maker usually compares the marginal benefits with marginal costs and take a course of action if the marginal benefit of that action is greater than the marginal costs. Not simply total costs and benefits. It's the marginal benefits and marginal costs that we need to compare. I will give an example here. So back in March, this is Matt Hancock calling all the manufacturers who can produce oxygen ventilators. This, like many other products, was in short supply. And then companies responded. And the response was pleasantly surprising. Response came from Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce, as you know, produces some of the most expensive cars, and also they produce jet engines. Siemens, Formula One team McLaren, you wouldn't expect them to do this. Aerospace company BAE Systems, they produce weapons, fighter jets, and the Ford producing cars. So you would expect that ventilators, oxygen ventilators, were usually produced by medical technology companies. Now, the process of making this decision is economics, basically. It involves comparing marginal benefits. You compare the benefits of switching to oxygen ventilator production or continuing producing the usual goods that Rolls-Royce produces. And it seems the managers expect more benefits from producing oxygen ventilators. The marginal benefit of producing the oxygen ventilator appears to be higher for them than the costs. And at the same time, marginal benefits of producing oxygen ventilators were also higher than the marginal benefits of producing the Rolls-Royce. There are several reasons, of course, for that. There's a lot of economics behind it. They would probably would have expected a downturn in demand for their goods, but the decision required them to think at the margin. Of course, they would have taken into account the opportunity costs, other trade-offs, but this is an example of thinking at the margin. For them, of course, switching to production of oxygen masks, the marginal cost wouldn't involve much because they already have the engineers, they would have research and development expertise, they have the equipment. All they needed were parts, and parts most likely were available at the time. The marginal benefits was higher than the marginal costs for them to switch. Let's now demonstrate the marginal decision-making process using a paradox of value example, or water diamond paradox. The question Adam Smith asked back in the 18th century was, why is water so cheap while diamonds are so expensive? He realized that the water was needed to survive, while diamonds are not necessary. They are not essential, right? But they are more expensive than water. So here we have to remind ourselves that we're dealing with economics. So this is about the scarcity and supply and demand. There's plenty full of water, but not much of diamonds. Your willingness to pay for a good depends on the marginal benefits you get from this good. For example, the marginal benefit of additional water is not as good. You drink one cup, second cup, a third cup, you lose this sort of benefits that you had with the first cup. You're not thirsty anymore after the second cup. But if you're offered diamonds, you get 10 grams of diamond, you're very happy. You get another one, you're still happy. You get more, you're still happy. You see that the marginal benefit here is higher from getting a diamond than water. So this is an example of marginal decision making. Another example, not on these slides, is the airlines. Imagine you work for an airlines company. Now you realize that before the flight takes off, you have few seats. Let's say 2 more seats left, no one has bought them. And you're selling the tickets for $100. There's only, let's say, an hour before the flight takes off. A customer comes to you and then says, I would like to buy, let's say, 1 ticket for $50. What's your response? Well, this is a 50% discount on the original price. You need to think now at the margin here. If you sell the ticket for $50, there is money coming in, and the marginal cost of this additional passenger is probably food they eat on the plane. The fuel expenses not going to be high with this additional customer, so it's the food or can of soda drink, but marginal benefit is additional $50. Now consider not selling the ticket. Well, then you don't get anything. So marginal benefits of selling the ticket is higher than the marginal cost, so you will sell the ticket. So these are the examples of thinking at the margin, or examples of marginal decision making. Incentives. Incentives are an important topic in economics. In fact, one famous economist said people respond to incentives and everything else is just a commentary. So this is the summary of economics according to him. People, yes, indeed respond to incentives, and incentives are things that induce people to act. And when people are rational decision makers, they compare costs and benefits and they respond to incentives accordingly. For example, when the prices are increased, consumers consume less, but sellers produce more. So this is a classic example of response to incentives. Think of gasoline, the petroleum. When the prices are higher, fewer people drive, there is more incentive to take public transport or to cycle or walk to work, for example. But the sellers have incentive to produce more because it's more profitable now to produce gasoline or even switch from other fuel types, for example. Yeah. So policymakers should consider the consequences of their actions or consequences of passing certain laws and regulations because of the incentives. People may react differently to different laws and regulations. People respond to incentives because incentives affect their costs and benefits calculation. As a result, it affects their behavior. But sometimes incentives can have unintended consequences. Sam Peltzman in 1975 observed that seatbelt belts make accidents less costly, so they reduce the likelihood of injury and death, but they at the same time reduce the benefits of slow, careful driving, because once a person has a seatbelt, they would think that they are safer, they are in a safety, in a comfort zone, so they start driving faster. This results in obviously large accidents. So here, intention of the policymaker was to reduce the accidents, save lives, reduce the injuries, but there is an unintended consequence, and that leads to larger accidents. The net result is that there is a little change in the number of deaths and an increase in the number of pedestrian deaths, apparently. Before the seatbelt laws were enacted, I think it was in the 1960s, people used to drive slowly, carefully, and considerately. That means there weren't as many accidents. But even if there were a small number of accidents, policymakers went ahead with seatbelts, thinking that that should even be lower. I mean, the seatbelts should reduce accidents. But it turns out it had unintended consequences. Markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. Most of the high-value economic activities take place in markets. Let's take two cases to demonstrate how markets work and which one works better. Take communist countries. There aren't many these days. The markets are planned centrally, or market activities are planned centrally. Usually government officials, or we call them central planners, are the best people to allocate the economy's resources. And they are also considered to be the best people to provide the equitable and efficient allocation of resources. So they will be responsible for what goods and services produced, how much to produce, and who would produce these resources. I mean the output, using the limited resources. But today we realize that this economic planning or central planning doesn't work well. That's why Soviet Union collapsed. That's why some other countries previously had centrally planned economies became capitalist economies. Now with the market economy, there is no central planning. Allocation of resources are guided by other factors like the prices and self-interest. There is no one to look out for the market, for the economy. And that sounds bad, doesn't it? Somebody needs to look out for this economic activities. Anything can happen. But it is better than communist countries where the planning takes place centrally. Someone dictates what you buy and what you wear and what you eat. I'll just give an example from Soviet Union. In the 60s, if I remember correctly, Soviet Union would say to its people, we eat fish on Thursdays, only fish. Soviet Union faced shortage of goods and services. The central planners were not able to steer the economy well. In the UK or USA, there was nothing like this. No one imposed restrictions on what you eat. But Soviet Union had to do that because central planning wasn't working at the time. So market economy is more optimal, and majority of economists, vast majority I should say, consider market economy as the way forward when it comes to organizing real allocation of resources. Now, the allocation of resources takes place through the interaction of firms and households in the market. And of course they are guided by prices and self-interest, and also incentives. Now, the way how people interact, according to Adam Smith, depends on the invisible hand in the market economy. Individuals do not act on others' interests or do not work for others because it benefits them, but they work because it benefits them. I mean, a person conducts an economic transaction is because that transaction benefits them. It is in their self-interest. So buyers and sellers act on their self-interest and achieve a socially optimal outcome. You can think of it this way. There is a simple example here. If you are in an island, deserted island, several of you, what would you do? You start specializing in trade. Everyone does what they can do better. Everyone needs to eat. So somebody goes up the tree, brings down some coconut. Somebody starts building huts because they can do it better than climbing the tree. Somebody dives in the sea and catches some fish. And in the end, you will exchange the goods to benefit yourselves, yeah? That's the organization of economy. So there is a desirable outcome as a result. This sort of exchange of the goods is a process of market economy, evolution of market economy. If government intervenes in this process and sets the prices for coconut or prices for fish or building the huts or regulates the economy, in other words, what happens is that it may not be, in your best interest to act. In that case, market economy collapses. The ability of the invisible hand is crippled. We'll give an example now with market for taxes. In many countries, market for taxis is controlled. Local governments usually impose strict controls on the market for taxis, how much they can charge. They also impose strict regulations on insurance and safety of the cars. There is also some sort of limit to entry. Not everyone can just enter the taxi market, and the government determines how much you can charge. This may not be in the best interest of the consumers and also taxi drivers. Sometimes governments may ask for reduction in prices. That means fewer taxi drivers will be willing to work. Sometimes governments may put up the price of taxis. That means fewer customers would hail taxis, and that leads to overcrowded public transports. So this market for taxis do not work with the centralized control and planning. Now, recently, Uber launched an app, taxi hailing app, that allows the passengers to hail drivers, and that reduced the need for driving around in the cities, streets, looking for customers. That's saved, of course, that's an achievement of efficiency here. But they aren't actually taxis because they do not roam the streets. So they are not subject to some strict regulations, especially in the USA. In New York, the service, however, is the same. And sometimes you would see that Uber drivers are cheaper as well. Hailing an Uber compared to conventional taxi would be cheaper. Uber could be expensive in cases such as severe storms, maybe events happening may cause the Uber to surge the prices, because there will be certainly demand for more taxis because the people convene into large cities, and then that crowds the public transport, so people tend to hail taxis, so there's a surge of prices. This is a classic example of incentives. It's a response to prices. There is little or no control by the government. The market now efficiently allocates the resources. Taxi drivers do not have to drive the cars around and waste energy. People do not have to leave their workplaces to hail a taxi standing outside. They could spend that 10 minutes working on the project, let's say, while the taxi is on its way once they book it. So there's this sort of efficient allocation of resources here. It essentially increases consumer well-being. Now, surge pricing is negative effect, of course, but this is basically a natural outcome of incentive-based explanation of economics. When the prices are higher, greater number of taxi drivers enter the market. But as more cars join, the price will eventually come down. So, classic example of supply and demand. Right. So, in the end, maybe traditional taxi drivers do not like Uber drivers. It is in the best interest of consumers. The outcome is socially optimal in this case. So Adam Smith would have loved Uber. Now, governments can sometimes help improve market outcome. Government intervention is not always bad. When do we need government to step in? We need the government to enforce rules and maintain institutions. Now, rules and institutions help us enforce property rights. If you produce coconuts on an island, it is possible that it gets stolen. You may need a protection. We may be powerless to stop that behavior. So you would lose incentive to produce or to pick coconuts. Invisible hand obviously doesn't help in this case. It is a totally different situation. The government can step in and then develop institutions, police force who would protect your property. And you may have a very inventive person who would invent new technologies that make life easier. It might help you, let's say a technology might help you to climb up the tree, and you may be interested in buying that technology. But then on the other hand, there is someone who can copy this technology and sell you at a cheaper price. So the idea's developer, the original developer of the idea, might find it very, very offensive and very off-putting. So again, you need the government to intervene in the market economy. And markets fail sometimes. Resources are not allocated efficiently. Then we need the government to intervene. And maybe resources are not allocated equally. So we need the government to promote equality and reduce income inequality. Let's look at these cases one at a time. Property rights, as we mentioned earlier, are important. It helps the, let's say, inventor, an example here, to reap the benefits of their invention. They could have a control over scarce resources. They can sell their products freely without a fear of losing their, let's say, copyrights, or without a fear that someone else copies and benefits from them. So imposing property rights is the government's role. Individuals on their own will not be able to do that. Even if the invisible hand works to bring together people and companies or firms into the market, it is unable to impose property rights. A market failure, for example, it is a situation where markets do not function on their own. Price mechanism doesn't function well, in other words. And classical example is the externality. Pollution is an externality. Production of rubber emit a lot of pollution into the air and also pollution into the water resources. It harms the environment as a result. In the absence of government control or intervention, invisible hand simply leads to production of more of this resource and consumption of more of this resource as well. But governments can step in here, moderate the process of this production and reduce the negative impact of this externality. When an entity has an ability to control the market price, or if they have a power to set the prices as they wish, then markets fail. Because with their influence, they can keep the prices high and it leads to resource misallocation. So this is a case of market failure. Not everyone will be able to, let's say, afford certain goods because of a single producer having a market power. In the absence of government control, this outcome is not desirable, is not socially optimal. So moving on now, economic inequality, for example, or disparities in economic well-being can prevail in market economy. And we know that market economy rewards people, it incentivizes people, and people produce and consume according to their abilities. But invisible hand does not ensure that everyone gets to eat. Some people become poorer, while some become very much richer. In that process, the income inequality or income gap becomes larger. In this case, to reduce this sort of disparity, the government will step in. The government will enact some sort of public policies that are aimed at achieving a more equal distribution of wealth. However, this process is not perfect, and this is because policymakers are not perfect. They are not angels. They don't do magic. Nevertheless, government intervention helps to improve well-being of poor section of the society. In the absence of government control, it's likely that the invisible hand may lead to suboptimal redistribution or distribution of wealth and resources. Governments can intervene to correct undesirable outcomes.